think by any objective measure, this has been a pretty weird week. Stuff like this going on with these impeachment hearings over the last several days. We've seen emerge a picture of reality that's actually pretty clear and objectively understandable, but yet our country is arguing about it endlessly. And I think, it's pretty clear that we as a country are extremely divided. One of the key ways that we're divided is by geography. This is some research that I did starting back in 2016 and also in 2012 that shows that we're divided by population density. So basically you can predict what people's voting behaviors are going to be based on the population density of the county in which they live. And it turns out that there's a clear crossover point that has persisted for the last 5 presidential elections, and it's about 1,000 to 1,200 people per square mile. So if you live in a place denser than that, you're almost always going to vote Democrat, and if you live in a place that's less dense than that, you're almost always going to vote Republican. Now, this division has led to a point where, this is based on some research by Liliana Mason at University of Maryland, that says that 20% of Americans now say they would approve of some kind of violence in politics, and that 25% of people would approve of splitting the country into 2. How have we gotten to this place? So to understand this a little bit better, I want to start talking about what we can learn from looking at the study of cults. So you might know about some different kinds of cults. We usually think about the guy on the left there, Jim Jones, as being sort of the prototypical cult person. But basically, there are other kinds of cults that have emerged over the course of history. And so you see up in the upper right a still from the popular film The Godfather, which depicted a kind of a mafia that could be considered a kind of a cult. And then in the lower right, something more local here, the Salem witch trials from 1692, which also exhibited some of these characteristics. So let's take a look at some of the characteristics that we might be able to infer from thinking about cults. So this is how you might conceive of the structure of a cult, where each red dot is the member of the cult, and then over on the right, we've got the leader. And what this suggests is that there is sort of a strong amount of social capital that exists amongst the members, and then also a strong amount of social capital that exists between the members and the cult leader. This is what you might consider to be a more healthy structure for a society, where there's lots of cross-cutting connections that bridge together different types of networks. So again, if you consider these colors to be maybe people of different backgrounds or different upbringings, what have you, and then all of these crazy lines between them being the kind of things that balance us as a society to keep us from becoming isolated and from adopting views that may not be in our long-term best interest. So, but what's been happening, though, is that we've been starting to kind of sort ourselves and to break ourselves apart into ever more homogenized and tightened groups that each have a lot of social capital internally. And ultimately, we might find ourselves in a situation that looks quite a bit like this, where we really are not talking to each other, we don't really believe that there's any common interest that we actually have, and we are completely and totally divided. So, a topic that comes up in the study of terror networks and cults is this concept of radicalization. And it's the tipping point when people become more interested in preserving the values of their in-group and of their cult than they are of the broader society values. And if you think about it, that's kind of inducing a kind of a cognitive error in these people, where they're basically willing to take on beliefs that are not in their long-term best interest as a species. So then you add in the problem of disinformation on top of this, which we've seen a lot of, and just to be really clear, disinformation is information that's distributed with the intention of causing harm, and then misinformation is information that may or may not be true, but is distributed without the intention of causing harm. But both are problems that lead to these kinds of outcomes. So it divides us into in-groups and out-groups. It hardens the boundaries between the groups so that we become less willing to interact with groups that are outside of our own. It induces excess social capital within these groups, and this is key because what that ends up doing is it makes people convinced that their beliefs are the universal beliefs that everyone should have. And this is where the cognitive errors that come with cultism come into play. And again, it leads to cognitive errors in group decision making. So if you think about it, we can't address topics like climate or our long-term, strategic interests as a nation if we're all, basically operating on top of these cognitive errors. And it basically turns truth into a political position rather than anything that can be squared with objective reality. So when you have this going on top of all this, and to be fair, this is a necessary process that our republic is having to go through right now in order to settle a very complicated and awful situation that we're in. But this process acts kind of like disinformation because it drives this cultification kind of process, pushing us further into our own little cliques and having us become ever more convinced that we are the sole possessors of truth. So again, we have this kind of driving force that's taking us into a further and further sorted, separated set of networks. And so this is leaving us in a position where we're not able to address things like election security. We have a big election coming up next year, and it's practically unprotected. And we are unable to make the kinds of decisions that we need to make in order to defend this election. Likewise, we can't deal with topics like climate because we are so internally mired in our own politics and unable to deal with external threats that we simply cannot address this topic in an effective way. Now, social media companies could be playing a better role in helping to solve this problem, but instead they're mostly making it worse. Just a handful of things that somebody like Facebook could do to improve the situation include allowing the pages to have clear citations as to who's publishing them. Right now, there's all kinds of pages on Facebook that are simply unattributed. They allow people to share outdated content without any warnings, and people are constantly sharing, fake celebrity deaths and out-of-date celebrity deaths, and it just undermines the entire information landscape, and it's such a simple change. They also don't have a real way for people to actually report disinformation campaigns. You can report something as false news, but I hate to break it to you, there's a lot more kinds of disinformation, including what they call coordinated inauthentic activity that could be using true information, and you still need some way to report that. There's no way to do that on Facebook right now. Facebook was developed without an intentional design in terms of its long-term side effects on society, and that has to change. And they could be doing so much more to minimize disinformation. So, we also hear a lot about the advertising policies going on with the different companies, and I kid you not, this is an email I got 2 days ago from Sputnik, which is, the Russian state news service. They wanted my comment on Google's changes in their advertising policies. I can't make this stuff up, And I'm like, I declined to respond to this, actually, because I don't want my words used against me by the Russian state. But, Twitter has said that they're not going to accept political advertising, which, I don't think they were getting a lot of revenue from that anyway. It hasn't made it impossible for you to pay somebody to spread information on Twitter, so I'm not sure if that's that big of a change. Facebook has said that they are not going to block lies, and Google is saying they're not going to allow targeting. Okay, that's great, but there isn't any kind of sensible strategy for dealing with this problem, and mostly the tech companies are shirking their responsibility. So, in terms of what we can expect for this upcoming election, this impeachment process is going to play out. It looks very likely that the House is going to vote to impeach the president. It's probably very unlikely that the Senate would vote to convict. On the other hand, if they decide to do something like a secret ballot, which they can do if 3 senators on the Republican side decide to pursue that, they could actually, maybe in a secret ballot environment get to 67 votes. I'd be surprised. But let's just say that isn't going to happen, and we start hurtling into the primaries in just a couple of months. And this is kind of who's making the decisions about what we're going to be seeing in the primaries. It's very likely that Pete Buttigieg sounds like he's leading in polls in Iowa and New Hampshire. Joe Biden seems to be doing well in places like South Carolina. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders are doing well in a lot of other states. There isn't really a clear consensus about how this contest is going to play out. And if we do get to a point where there's a nominee, there's going to be a significant number of people in the country that don't support one of these people for a variety of reasons, some of which maybe are valid, some of which aren't. But the end result is we may not have a very strong candidate on the Democratic side heading into a November election. So in terms of what I'm hearing from talking to people in the disinformation space and in the hacking space and that kind of thing about what we might expect for this next election would be more disinformation and deep fakes, so forgeries and other kinds of things designed to get people riled up and excited about supporting or not supporting different people or what have you. Various kinds of information noise, the Russians call this infoshum. This is sort of like nothing articles that are designed to just create noise that overwhelms actual content that might be important. Power infrastructure attacks. I think this is going to be the real money shot if they can pull it off. Is to disable the power grid on election day. Now, that's sort of the nightmare scenario, but there might be other variants of that. Things called email bombs, where people start suddenly getting so much email that they can't deal with it, and they're unable to get information about voting places and stuff like that. Various kinds of phishing and hacking, as happened in 2016, proved to be extremely effective. And then various kinds of election infrastructure hacks, such as attacking voter rolls, voting machines, tabulation, all those kinds of processes that allow us to actually run a free and fair election could be compromised. And because we have a 50-state attack surface area, we are very, very vulnerable to it. And if you haven't noticed, there's been a lowering of resources at the federal and state level on a lot of these security protections for elections rather than an increasing. That's extremely worrisome, and I think the worst possible outcome that we might find in November 2020 is that the outcome of the election is inconclusive or contested. And at that point, we're going to start hearing, well, we can't really be sure who won, so what are we going to do? Maybe we'll not, skip this election and have another one in 2024. So, United States, I ask, can we be united? Can we be brought together somehow? For 15 minutes after 9/11, we were kind of on the same page. I think that lasted maybe literally about 45 days, maybe 60 days, maybe 6 months if we want to be generous, but it wasn't long before we were back at each other's throats and before the world had turned its attention away from the United States. After the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall, people were very optimistic, and we were all looking forward to a peaceful future that was past the end of history. But again, this fades. These kinds of superordinating situations that cause us to sort of come together are rare, and I don't know what that might be. Maybe aliens could attack or something, and that would get us all on the same page, but I don't think that's happening soon. And again, we're unable to address climate. And we would think that climate might be something that could unite us. It should be something like that, but instead it's a code word for political acrimony. This is another problem, gerrymandering. This is a font that was made out of gerrymandered congressional districts, just to kind of prove the point that they're all kinds of shapes. And that's something that's a severe problem in the United States and needs to be addressed. Ranked choice voting is another thing that we could be pursuing to basically bring us more together around the candidates that are actually elected. So instead of saying the one candidate that you're willing to vote for, pick your top three, and then you can use that math to make sure that the best candidate that everybody is pleased with becomes the ultimate winner. So the thing I think we have to be concerned about is that this guy, once he's gone, is that going to solve the problem? Arguably, I think it won't, because I think that this is what's going to be left behind in the wake of this presidency and of this time in history, is this divided society that isn't united around anything and that can't govern itself and is going to be divided further by more disinformation, by more noise and acrimony. And this is the thing that we have to address. So I know that sounds pretty bleak. And, I'm not sure we're going to be able to get around this. This could be the challenge of our lifetimes. However, I would argue that there are things that we can do. I think we need to focus on looking at the meta-politics of this situation instead of just on politics. It can feel very satisfying simply to hate the other side and to, want to defeat them and all that, and that's fantastic. We should all vote our conscience and work on the things that we think matter. But I think we also have to be very cognizant of the game that's being played on American society right now and the effort that's being made to divide us. And we should turn a lot of our effort and a lot of our anger to fighting those things, because if we don't fix that, we will never have a democracy in this country again. We also need to focus on our collective well-being. Instead of our just kind of thinking about the individual, and the Western tradition has kind of taught us that the individual is the seat of all logic and reason, and that feeds into democracy and all that. We think very rarely about how our collective population is vulnerable to attack, and that's something that we need to fix. We need to think about the ways that we're vulnerable and improve our use of data and the regulation of the use of data by big companies like Facebook and Google and all the rest. And we need to protect our institutions. You know, we all have institutions that we care about and that are connected with, and they're under attack. I'm dealing right now with a Kremlin mole situation at the Washington Post, of all places, and it's incredibly difficult to deal with these problems because of the way that they're woven into the institutional politics. I'm also not advocating for centrism. That's been a boogeyman that a lot of people have cited when people start talking about this problem, and I'm not talking about that. Vote your values and hold on to your beliefs, but win. Figure out a way to win, because if you don't win, if we don't win, we are not going to ever be able to execute on the kinds of values that each of us have. And I don't care what side you're on, if you can't figure out a way to win, you're not going to be able to pursue those things. So, I will close with this. Love your neighbors, love your fellow Americans, and God bless America, because we're going to need it. Thank you.